Next, our next speaker, I think, very clearly wins the award for coming the furthest for this presentation. He's flown in from California. He also is the father of a recent graduate from the MBA program, which is how we got connected with Mr. Ronnie Andrews. He is the president of medical sciences for a company called Lifetech out in California. In this role, he works to transition molecular discoveries into applications to actually improve patient care, and he'll do a much better job in his presentation of describing how he does that. In his prior role, he founded a company called Clarion Inc., had a wildly successful company. They were bought out in 2010 by GE Healthcare, and he'll probably tell you a little bit about that story as well. He is a board member on our MBA board of directors. He is a mentor to current MBA students, and as a non-alum, he is uber engaged, and we are so proud to have him. So thank you so much, Ronnie, for being here. Clicker and a pointer if you want it.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and I know I'm the only thing standing between you guys and lunch, so I will do my best to be a Southern boy who does talk fast, unlike Sam. Listen, it's a pleasure to be here. It's really even a greater pleasure to be an adopted family member at Ole Miss. When Ryan decided to leave the beach in Southern California to come to Ole Miss, it didn't surprise me because I'm a Georgia boy, grew up in Georgia. My wife's from Middle Georgia, and we are very, very Southern. And although we've moved 14 times in almost 28 years of marriage and lived all over the world, reality is we've always been Southern, and we've tried to raise our kids Southern. And so when Ryan decided he wanted to come to Ole Miss, to me that was a great thing. But I didn't know Ole Miss till I spent about 4 visits in the fall in the Grove. And then I fell in love with Ole Miss. And it was just an amazing adventure for him in 4 years, and then to get his MBA here. And so then shortly after that, I have a young, beautiful daughter who was entering high school. And we would, as a father of a beautiful, beautiful young girl, you learn one thing: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And any pubescent, testosterone-loaded teenage boy was my enemy. And so I learned the only way to get to their heart was to cook for them on Saturday and teach them about SEC football. Because you see, on the West Coast, it's the Pac-10, the Pop Warner Athletic Conference. And so we would start smoking ribs and pork shoulders in the morning, and my daughter, as a freshman in high school, would bring those boys over, and we'd sit and watch football all day. And the moral of that story is, when she graduated from high school this year, her high school boasted more kids going to the SEC than to California schools. And at the graduation parties, I was the man accused of sending all those young women and men to the Southeastern Conference, and I was very proud of that. And I am very blessed that my beautiful daughter, who happened to show up to see Dad speak today, is a freshman here at Ole Miss in forensic chemistry. So unlike my son, who went the business route, she's going to follow Dad and try to do the science route. So listen, my talk today is really about an unlikely executive. I am probably the least likely person in this room to be standing before you today with the history and the adventure that I've been on for the last 30 years. You see, I grew up in the country. I grew up in a fairly, lower middle class family. We didn't have much, but as my mom said, she always had time for people. And I grew up with a grandmother who inspired me at a very young age. See, I'm the oldest of 17 grandkids, and you guys in the South, there's a patriarchal expectation of that oldest grandson. My grandmother, at 11 years old, got the C word. She got cancer. She came down with breast cancer. And they told her she had 6 weeks to live. And 3 years later, my ornery, mean grandmother, who said I'm too mean to die, and I have stripes on my fanny to prove that, she had survived her first round of breast cancer. And I'll never forget one night when she was going through her breast cancer. I was obviously, as the oldest of the grandkids and all the parents working jobs in the mills and such, I ended up having to take care of the rest of my cousins because everyone stayed with Meemaw. And I remember one night we'd put them all to bed, and we're sitting on the front porch, and my grandmother, we had one of those old metal gliders, and I don't know if you guys remember those, and we were gliding, and my grandmother reached over and grabbed my hand, and she said something extremely profound to me. She said, "Ronnie, you are smart enough to figure out how to cure this disease." And at that moment in time, I was dumb enough to believe her. My life then set a course that I really hadn't planned on, and I decided I had to go to college, or she decided for me. And so I decided I was going to go be a doctor, and I was going to treat cancer. And that was great. I went off, I ended up playing 4 years of college football, and that was a godsend and a miracle in its own right. It's too long a story for today. But I ended up playing at a 1AA school in the Carolinas, Wofford College. Ended up getting out of school and headed to med school and was doing an internship in that they forced all the pre-med students to do before they went off to med school at Spartanburg Regional Hospital. And I was working in the ER, and there was a car wreck, and there was people bleeding everywhere. And I saw, it was horrific. And the next thing I know, I'm on a gurney, and they got ammonia salts under my nose waking me up. And I realized, oh my gosh, my whole life was planned to go be a doctor. There's no way I can treat patients fainting on them when I'm trying to sew them up. So I decided, well, that's okay. I'll go find a cure for the disease. So I went into the PhD program at Georgia Tech thinking I'm going to go and solve the mystery, and ended up having to get a job in the process because my mother said that you can get a PhD, but you're not piling it high and deep on my dime. So I ended up going off and getting a job in R&D. Now, my job was in the bowels of an R&D facility, homogenizing rat kidneys and livers every day looking for drug toxicity. Now, you talk about a boring job. So what did I do? Now, you guys are too young, but some of the folks in the audience will probably remember. Saturday Night Live, Bill Murray and Eddie Murphy at the time had a great skit called Mr. Bill. So I named each one of my 5,000 mice. And when I would euthanize them, they would get a little comedy treatment. My lab partner thought I was crazy and told my boss that he thought I was the kind of guy who was going to end up on the roof with a shotgun. So I got fired from that job and had to go find my life's calling. So today I'm going to tell you a story about where that life's calling has taken me. And I want to finish with 3 ahas, because the first part's a little bit of a science lesson and there won't be a quiz afterwards. Part of my job, though, is hopefully to inspire you to understand that the technology of the 21st century is really technology that has far advanced our ability to understand what to do with it in medicine and how to pay for it in medicine. And these are MBA problems. They need solutions, and they're not going to come from the medical community. So I'm here to challenge you today, and I know that there's a rich history of banking, a rich history of manufacturing at University of Mississippi and in the MBA program, but I want to encourage you to also think about potentially opportunities in the world of medical sciences, because we need young entrepreneurs who really do more than just come in and do analytics and synthesis. They actually come in and care about what they're doing and the people they're doing it for. One of the proudest moments so far in my relationship with University of Mississippi was last fall. One of the friends, my son's friends, as he was finishing his MBA program, was a gentleman named Yan Kun. And Yan Kun was from China. And Yan Kun, I met him and fell in love with the kid and decided, you know what? We got a job in China. We're exploding our organization in China, and we got a job. Now, Life Technologies is a $4 billion conglomerate, one of the world's leading life science tool companies in genomics and proteomics. And we have programs with Stanford, Northwestern, and Harvard. So if you don't come from one of those MBA programs, you used to not get a job at Life Technologies. But last spring, I had the privilege of getting Yan Kun an interview with the team in China. And I told the guy in China that runs that business, who's not Chinese, I said, listen, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to interview these kids. I don't want you to look at where they're from. I want you to interview them, and I want you to then call me and tell me which person do you think will best do the best job, because they'll be focused on the right things. So the interviews went by that week, and Friday, Sid called and said, Ronnie, he said, I know why you wanted me to do that now. And I said, well, tell me why. He said, because today I hired Yan Kun. And I hired him over 2 Harvard MBAs, a Stanford MBA, and a Northwestern MBA. And he said, I hired him because Yan Kuhn looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and wanted to know about me, who I was, and what the goals of this organization were. He didn't want to tell me how great he was and his pedigree at Harvard was. So I want to encourage you at the beginning of this talk to think about this. You have an EQ, an emotional coefficient coming out of this school that guys that come and work for me from Harvard and Stanford typically don't have. And that is your edge, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's do this. Let's dive in. I'm going to fly through some fun slides about where we're going in medicine. And I want to say this too. Y'all, thank God for the movie Forrest Gump. Because 30 years of work in the molecular diagnostics world, I now have a moniker. I am the Forrest Gump of molecular diagnostics. And so I'm proud of that. People think it hurts my feelings. I think it's great because it shows that everybody's got a story. And so here's my story. Today we're going to talk really about this unlikely venture, my quest to really find a cure for the emperor of all maladies. If you haven't read that book, it's an amazing book on the history of cancer, way more interesting than you might find it, might think it might be. And then I'm going to give you three ahas. And candidly, you know what's great about today's speakers so far? Every one of them has hit on one of these points for me. So it'll just be a quick summary for me to kind of help you think about the aha moments that I've had in my life. The era of genomic medicine is really unveiling the mystery of cancer. The Human Genome Project started in the late 90s, and we used a technology called polymerase chain reaction, PCR as it's affectionately called. And I was very blessed in my adventure to somehow, miraculously, I always say my grandmother's looking down on me from heaven, and has convinced God that I'm the guy that needs to be doing all these crazy jobs, because I end up in some amazing places, and I really don't know how. But I ended up at the head of the world's largest molecular diagnostics company, running their commercial operations as we were exiting the Human Genome Project. And I got to work with some amazing guys. The guys that won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, for PCR, were on my staff. And it was just an amazing adventure to sit around and always be the dumbest guy in the room. So you have to get used to being the dumbest guy in the room if you're in my world. But it's not a bad thing because you learn a lot. But the reality is we realized coming out of the Genome Project that all that hope and what we thought we were going to see going in were all these answers to cancer and other diseases. And you know what we found when we got out of the Genome Project? We had way more questions than we had answers. $3.8 billion it took to map the human genome. It took us 7-8 years. It took 372 laboratories around the world to put the whole thing together. And today we sit here with the most amazing amount of knowledge. And today we sit here with the opportunity. Instead of $3.8 billion in 8 years, in January, the company that I had the blessing to be steward of is launching this chip, which will map the human genome, exome, or tumor genomes in 2 hours for $1,000. So if you know about Moore's Law and you know about the rapid escalation of technology, that even outpaces Moore's Law. The challenge we have, though, is this mystery of cancer that you're looking up here on the screen. Cancer is a genomic disease, but guess what? It sits in the amazing biology that you were created with. And every one of us sits there with a unique set of biology surrounding the genetics that makes you up. And so all these questions we thought we were going to have answers to really led us to this point, that cancer is still the emperor of all maladies because of the complexity of the genomics, the interaction to the transcriptomics, and then ultimately the production of proteins. Cancer is very complex. I usually talk about it this way. If cancer, pardon the Southern California analogy, but traffic isn't quite as bad here, and so this analogy won't work with Mississippi highways. So if you think about cancer as a blueprint being developed in a downtown Los Angeles architectural firm. And that blueprint goes in the tube and gets in the car, and that courier hops in and jumps in the car and hops on the I-5, runs down to the 133, cuts over to the manufacturing facility in beautiful Laguna Beach. Or they can go over and hit the 405 and go to the 405. Hopefully it's not rush hour, but they can go down and they can hit out and they can deliver that package. Or they can go out to the highway, Pacific Coast Highway, and go all the way down. And there's thousands of roads that go between there in that manufacturing facility. And one thing we know about cancer is, unless that genetic code gets to that manufacturing facility in the human cell, there are no cancerous proteins produced. This highway system is what you're looking at here. This is what we call the EGFR highway. But the reality is, there are unlimited amounts of ways that this courier can go. And the challenge that we have with cancer is we can stop one highway with blockading it with these new therapeutics that are coming out, but this friggin' guy's got a GPS in his car. And he just dials that GPS up and backs up and goes another way. So the challenge of cancer is really, how do we understand and create what I call the Google map of the cell? The beauty of the Human Genome Project, though, was it sent into action the amazing financial resources of pharmaceutical companies. And there's been billions of dollars invested in drugs that will shut down that highway system. When I first started in the cancer world, we knew lung cancer really two ways. It was either an adeno or a squamous cell carcinoma. And you treated the patient pretty much the same. It was just the outcome of one was better than the other. Since the Human Genome Project was ended, there have been almost 30 new therapeutics that are now in either phase 2, 3, or out on the market that interrupt various highway systems from that Google map that I just showed you that cause and deliver cancer. Now the challenge with that is that if you look at where we're going, there's 500 new drugs on the way. These drugs target one of those highway systems or more of those highway systems in the map I showed you. The beautiful thing is we're going to solve this one day and be able to make cancer a chronic disease. But the sad news is we today do not know how we're going to pay for the testing that's going to be required to create this information, and we don't know how we're going to deliver it to community physicians, and we don't know how we're going to educate those physicians on how to use it. So these are the challenges we face as we go forward, because today's model is really unsustainable. I'm a doc. I get a patient's biopsy. I send it out. I get some work back. Oh my gosh, that leads me to the next question. Well, now I got to send it to another lab. I get the results back, and now I send it. You know what happens? Over a period of 2 weeks, sometimes longer, we've spent $7,500 to figure out what the cancer is, and the patient's lost 40 days, and the 40 days in the life of a stage 3 or 4 cancer patient is their lifetime. And so for us, the challenge that we have going forward is really, how do we transform this industry? And like I said, I'm very blessed to work for a company called Lifetech. When we sold the company when we sold Clariant to GE Healthcare, and that's a fun story, and I'm going to kind of finish that story towards the end, because it's not every day a country boy from Georgia gets a phone call from the chairman of GE and wants to go to dinner with you. And so I want to finish with that story. But this semiconductor capability has now given us the ability to really move towards creating information in real time that will provide us the ability to understand that cancer at the molecular level, peel back the onion, if you will, on this cancer, and to create the Google map of the cell, push that through the internet so that a physician in any community in the world can have that information for their patient at their disposal, and be able to act on that information. And so the promise of next generation sequencing is really right before us. We have it. We can now do it. We're in the middle of launching it and playing with this technology, which means we can do a complete profile of this cellular map really within about 2 to 4 hours. But what's the challenge? The challenge is that creates terabytes of data that, unless it can be collated and pressure tested against archived, curated sample sets from patients that have been looked at over a 20-year period, we don't know what to do with the information. So the era of personalized medicine that we are entering in this room, you will see cancer as a chronic disease. I'm going to be fishing on Pepper's boat when that time comes. But Dr. Dimmon's a good friend of mine and came in, and his mom's a retired professor here at Ole Miss, and he grew up in town, and Pepper and I decided this is a good time to reunite. And he's a former chief medical officer at GE Healthcare, and an Ole Miss fan and family member. So hit him up afterwards and ask him. He's got some great stories about entrepreneurism and healthcare as well. But we realize that the reality of where we're going is not about the technology to create the information, it's the technology to figure out what to do with the information. And how do we correlate that information to outcomes, and how do we create real-time capabilities? So physicians in my little town in Georgia, if you can imagine this, can open a laptop, open an iPad, log on to a password-protected, HIPAA as we call it in our world, protected website, pull down all your genomic and proteomic information about your cancer, look at it, and go, what the heck is that? Because if you're seeing 60 patients a day in a managed care environment, and you want to go home and have a family, there's no way you got time to go home and research on the internet what to do with all this new information. And if you've been out of school longer than 5 years, out of med school, you're going to be clueless as to what to do unless you have access to capabilities that will synthesize this information for you. So the business of medicine is really going to become the business of bioinformatics over the next 5 to 10 years. And I make this commitment and I make this statement frequently in front of audiences. The next 10 years will dwarf the last 50 years. Keep in mind, a lot's happened in 50 years. MRIs, CT scans, new therapeutics. The next 10 will dwarf the last 50 in oncology because of people like you who decide to take an interest and be inspired to make your life's calling about taking this technology and doing something about it. You see, this is a slide from my previous life from Clariant, 42-year-old male. On your right, or your left, you'll see he had metastatic lung cancer. And basically was given 6 weeks to live and told he had palliative care. Now this is a fairly famous person, so I can't name him. But the reality is we got a call one day, and they said, Ronnie, we need you to do something about this. Can you do some molecular screening of this patient? And we said, of course, it's a business we're in. And if you look at the CAT scan, you'll see in the upper left hand, I think I got a pointer here, you see up here, you see this is the mass. This is the lung mass. For those of you on that side, oh, can't get there. It's right here, right? And so we began to do some analysis, and we began to do a deep dive at the molecular what caused this tumor. And what we realized is this tumor might have been a lung cancer, but it looked way more like a colon cancer. So what we decided to do was recommend that the physicians at MD Anderson begin to treat this patient with these colon cancer drugs. Seems crazy, but the reality is the next 10 years we will define a cancer by its pathways and its genomics, not by what site it comes from. Because you see a lot of the drugs that solve problems in breast cancer also solve problems in colon cancer and other cancers, and vice versa. So this patient went on those drugs. Unfortunately, insurance wouldn't pay for it. He happened to be blessed enough in life to be able to pay for it, but this is one of the other challenges we have as MBA students is how do we create awareness and knowledge, and how do we create a balance between our life and the quality of a life and the cost of saving that life. But he went on these drugs, and you can see on the right-hand side, he was told he had 6 weeks to live, and now I just talked to him before I came because I wanted to make sure that it was okay to share this, and he's still cancer-free 4 years later. This is the power of where we're going. But the challenge is, with the Affordable Care Act and some of the other legislation that's going on today, how are we going to actually make sure that these types of treatments get paid for in a constrained, capitated healthcare environment? And those are MBA problems, not scientific problems. You see, today the challenge is this. How do we understand as the cost of doing gene sequencing for tumors goes down, how do we create value for the information? How do we extract value for that information? And then how do we deploy this information so that no one has to die from this disease? So let me take a second and tell you the ahas, because the ahas, thank goodness, have nothing to do with science. But I want to share these because I've lived 30 years in the very scientific world. I've been blessed, as I say, to be the Forrest Gump of that industry. And I want to tell you the things, though, that I think have helped me be successful. And the first one is the power of servant leadership. You know, I've never been the smartest guy in the room, so I can't outsmart anybody, but I've always been able to outserve everybody. Now, thank God I had an amazing role model and a grandmother and a mother whose whole life was serving other people. My mother's 77 and still works 60-hour-a-week job because she can't quit serving people. And the reality is, what I see in this is an amazing capability that if you put other people first and you make sure you're solving their problems, that it comes full circle to you. In fact, as I was a young rep and trying to break into the business world for Abbott Diagnostics, I was fortunate to work for a mentor named Rick Gonzalez. Rick is now the COO of Abbott Labs and soon to become CEO of the new pharmaceutical division as they split the company at the end of the year. And I remember sitting at dinner one night looking up at Rick in many ways and said, Rick, how can I be as successful as you are? And he said, Ronnie, remember one thing. Make sure everybody else around you is successful and you'll never have to worry about your own success. And so I want to challenge you, though, because I get accused a lot of servant leadership being soft leadership. And I'm here to tell you it's anything but soft. That meekness isn't weakness, it's strength under control. And because you have a title doesn't mean you have to use it. In fact, I would argue you gain more credibility and loyalty by not using the title, but using influence than you do using your title in any situation. So the true measure of leadership is really influence. It's not your position, it's your disposition, and it has to be earned no matter what situation you're in. And I want to, and I also want to say something that Sam said, and I was really touched by Sam this morning, because my story is not a promise I made to my mother. My story is a promise I made to my grandmother. And so I can really relate to a lot of what he said by being raised by an amazing woman of faith with integrity and character who practiced that every day in very, very unique ways. Humility is truly the cornerstone of great leadership. I've been blessed to sit at the table with some very powerful people in the world, and I can tell you honestly that the most powerful people in the world that have impressed me are the ones that are the most humble about how they got there and why they got there, and that they are the most willing to give of themselves to help others realize that it wasn't about them, it was about something much bigger than them in their life. But just to prove my point about servant leadership, there was a book called Good to Great. How many of you guys have read it? I hope everybody, if you haven't, get it. It's one of the best business books I know of. In Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, he looked at companies over a 20-year period, and he began to do deep dives into things that made them go from just being a good company to being a great company. And these companies, over that period, were able to clearly identify their passion, clearly identify their purpose, and they, there we go, 17.5% return on those companies. The S&P only grew 10.4% during that same period. So this book was so popular, there were some guys that thought there were servant leadership-oriented people, and they decided, you know what, we're going to write a book about servant leadership. And they wrote it called 7 Pillars of Servant Leadership, and they did the same analysis of the same period that Jim Collins did. And there's some companies here you're going to recognize, right? FedEx, great local company. Southwest, we talked about. Service Masters. And the interesting thing about these companies that claim to be servant leadership oriented is that if you look at these companies and how they related, you can see that the S&P 10.8, good to great companies 17.5, servant leadership companies grew 24.2%, outpaced all of those companies. And the question is, why did they do that? And the reality is they did it because their whole focus was on helping someone else become successful and doing that with sincerity and with their energy and their passion. Here are the traits. I'm not going to go through these because of time, but you can see that the servant leaders really use their passion to release the energies of others. And you know, one of my favorite servant leadership stories is a man who changed the scope of my generation, a man named Martin Luther King. And he had a quote that I love. It says, "The greatest good we can do for others is not to give them your riches, but to teach them or reveal in them their own riches." And that's the essence of what servant leadership is about. You know, I sat in a meeting. I've just been at Lifetech 7 months. I left GE and Clariant to go be a part of this gene chip revolution and bring it into medicine. And I was sitting in a room that was built by a great bunch of guys, but they were talking about keeping people on a short leash and let's light a fire under them. And it hit me that the culture of this company had fallen away from the innovative growth culture of servant leadership and had fallen on a power-oriented, beat the heck out of people culture. And it hit me that the the real reality of servant leadership is it's way better to light a fire within people than have to continually run around and light a fire under people. So if you take anything away from this talk today, figure out how to inspire people versus how to kick them in the butt and make them get something done. The second one's a consistent theme this morning: build and protect your personal brand. You know what? Everybody has a brand. You know, why do people stand in line? The other day I was going to get coffee at the airport, and Starbucks line was about 20 people long. Right next door was the Cinnabon place. Guess what kind of coffee they served at Cinnabon? Starbucks. Guess how many people were in line? Nada. It's California. They don't eat stuff like that, right? So I went in line, jumped in, got my coffee, paid half of what I paid next door. Why? People want the experience. You have a brand, folks, whether you believe it or not. There's two types of people in this world: people that brighten the room when they walk in, or people brighten it when the door hits them in the butt on the way out. And you need to decide which one of those you want to be. Because in business, being the former, not the latter, will create a distinguished, sustainable advantage for you in the corporate world. Great book, 5 Levels of Leadership, called Developing the Leader Within You, from John Maxwell. I encourage you to get it, to read it. You'll realize that where you want to be, no doubt of that, everybody in this room wants to be in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. You want to be respected, but to get there, you have to serve, and you have to have a brand of integrity and character. And finally, the last slide, find your life's calling. You know, it wasn't until my grandmother, on her deathbed, after she had lived 36 years with 4 different rounds of cancer, being told she was going to die in 6 weeks to 6 months every time. On her deathbed, the night she was dying, she sent everybody out of the room and said, "I want Ronnie to stay." And I sat down on her bed, and she grabbed my hand, and she looked at me, and she said, "You know what, Ronnie?" Because I had gotten away from the cancer world, guys. I had moved on, and it was about money. I'd done another startup. The startup was worth about $1.5 billion at the time, and we were doing great. And I was really not worried about cancer. My grandmother ran everybody out. She grabbed my hand, and the only way she could, she said, "You know what, son?" She goes, "I'm going to be with Jesus tonight." She said, "You promised me at 16 you were going to go do something about this disease. It's time you got to your life's calling." And I realized the soul searching I had to do after that evening really led me to a point, and it was already mentioned twice today. If you can take your passion in life and know what your gifts are, and listen, we've all got gifts. It's not like you were being, God was creating and somebody slipped out and went, "Oops, sorry, good luck down there." Everybody's got gifts. Figure out now why you're in the MBA pro. Figure out what those gifts are and understand them well. Figure out what your gifts aren't. Because you need to surround yourself as you enter the business and corporate world with people who have gifts that you don't have to complement you. And then use your experiences. And the intersecting component of this is really where you want to be in life. And I'm very blessed and thankful my grandmother called me on that, because I left and quit my job that I was in the next day, gave up the number 2 at a very amazing startup that ended up selling for about $2 billion. And I went on my quest to start a company in California called Clariant, that really whole focus in life was to take the ability to take a cellular image from a very high-powered device that couldn't be purchased by most community hospitals because of the expense, but using the digital world we live in, digitize that information, push it over the internet, empower local pathologists to manage that information locally, so women like my grandmother didn't have to drive 200 miles to Emory University to see a physician whose name she couldn't spell and name, and who could care less about her. She could get treated in her local community with the same academic level of medicine that you get treated at Emory. It was an idea. It was an idea to do something for my grandmother that turned into a $600 million purchase in 7 years of hard work, but GE Healthcare stepped up and bought that company a year and a half ago, and now they're serving women globally with that same capability. So my point is, find your passion, understand your gifts, align them, and go for it. And you'll be able to really, really create a great, great adventure for yourself. So thank you for your time today, and I don't know if we still have time for a couple questions, but if you got questions, fire away. Everybody's hungry. Yes, sir.
What would you do about the healthcare funding? What do you think the answer is?
You know, I get asked this a lot, and I was very blessed as a CEO before Clarent got acquired to be invited to D.C. as part of an industry CEO group when the Obama administration was putting together a plan. And we met with a number of members, high-ranking members of the administration, but also with the Lewin Group. And one thing became obvious, even though that we were all on different sides of the aisle at the time, the reality is the problem is pervasive and has to be fixed. I don't think government can fix health care. Let me just be candid. I think government needs to play a role in helping us fix it, without a doubt. I mean, the NIH funding that goes to the NIH every year, if it weren't for that, we wouldn't have the tools I'm sitting here talking about today. That came from amazing investment in cancer that was made by our government. But the reality is, I've traveled the world. I put infrastructure in 47 countries for various businesses, and I'm going to tell you something. You do not want to get sick in any country but the United States of America if you have a serious illness. You can criticize our health care, you can criticize it all you want to, and you can talk about European system, but I'll never forget, my wife and I, she took me on my 50th birthday. She took me to Italy, and we flew all night, and all night I was reading a white paper written by Rahm Emanuel's brother on the quality of health care and how to fix the cost of health care by looking at when to invest in a patient's or person's life based on their contribution to society. And when I got off the plane, I was so mad. I couldn't stand it. And so we get down to this beautiful beach area in Italy, and we're sitting there having breakfast because we flew all night, and there's folks on each side, and of course the whole healthcare debate was raging in the European papers, and there were Brits on both sides. And the guy goes, "Oh, you're from the," and my British accent will kill you. "You're from the U.S., aren't you?" And I go, "I am." And he goes, "What do you think about this healthcare problem?" I said, "You know what?" I said, "We still have the greatest healthcare in the world." He said, "Yeah, you know what? I don't know about that." He said, "We're pretty damn good at our own." And he said, "You know what?" He said, "Look at me." He said, "I'm 60-something, I'm healthy." And he smiled. He had no teeth. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Oh my gosh, this is where we're heading." Listen, the challenge we have with healthcare, if we don't do something about it, is there will be two tiers of healthcare. And the problem is the best doctors will opt for the highest quality of care. So the way to fix it is to distribute care and make sure that you triage care at the lowest cost point, and then move those people that need higher cost care into those higher cost parts of medicine, and that saves. And then what we're working on, which is, listen, $70 billion, a staggering number, last year spent on cancer therapeutics. 20 billion of that had no impact on the patient, zero. We do trial and error medicine. If we can use these tools to pick the right patient at the beginning of their disease, to get them the right drugs, they will cure, and we never have that long-term cost to healthcare, and you don't spend that 20 billion on drugs that don't work. So there's solutions, but we have to use our brain about how do we get at them. So. All right. Thank you all very much.